Hello, and a very warm welcome to a new episode of the Eurafrican-Alliance podcast. My name is Loretta, and I am the Vice Chair of the Eurafrican-Alliance. We are a non-profit organization based here in Germany. We are dedicated to strengthening the cooperation between Europe and Africa through dialogue, through knowledge exchange, and we execute sustainable development initiatives in Africa. And I'm happy to be your host today and grateful to have you joining us. Over the next 3 episodes, we are diving deep into an economic and social reality that really serves as a massive backbone for millions of livelihoods across West Africa and actually the whole of Africa. We're talking about remittances. So, what exactly counts as a remittance? How are these flows measured? Why do experts believe the official numbers may underestimate what is actually being sent? And beyond money, what else travels across borders when people migrate? Those are the questions we'll explore in today's episode as we examine the human side of remittances, from household support and family decisions to the broader ways migrants continue shaping their communities, the communities they call home. Today, I have with me to guide us through these issues, Simona Schreier. Simona is project manager at Munich Forum for Dialogue, where she coordinates international initiatives on migration cooperation, dialogue, and sustainable development. She also contributes to the field as a PhD researcher, bringing together academic research and practical experience on migration, on reintegration, and transnational development. So welcome to you, Simona Schreier. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Loretta, and thank you again for the invitation. It was a very nice initiative, and I'm really happy to be part of it. And I hope to then have an interaction later on with what we present today. So we'll delve into a bit. For the first episode, we'll try to bring a bit the fundamentals and the scale of what already Loretta kind of introduced. What is remittances? Who, the what, and how, and why? Just perhaps just to give a short example as a picture. Let's, for example, think of somewhere in Houston, in Texas, a Nigerian nurse finishes a double shift, opens an app, and sends $200 home to Lagos. 30 seconds, and that's done. By the time she's asleep, that money has paid a school fee, topped grandmother's blood pressure medication, and maybe covered a slice of someone's rent. Now, if we multiply that by millions of people every single month, and you've got one of the largest, really quietest financial flows on the planet, bigger than foreign aid, as Loretta already mentioned in the introduction. Steadier than oil money and almost invisible to official statistics. And that's what I'll try to go into a bit more detail of what is remittances, how do we measure it, and what is the missing picture, so to say, and in the remittances that we know, or that statistically we have the information.
Thank you so much for giving us that practical picture of what is really happening, let's say, behind the scenes. And as a migrant myself, it's you explained it exactly. That's what exactly happens in the life of most migrants. Organizations like IMF and World Bank use a much more specific definition for remittances. Could you explain what counts as a remittance under the IMF's BMS framework, when you can explain that for us, and why that definition actually really matters?
Yeah, exactly. So the really simplest definition is that a remittance is what migrants actually send back, or sending money or goods back home, and that's it. So it's really this financial remittance, but then I'll go into more detail of what other types of remittance there is. But yes, so the IMF uses the Balance of Payments Manual from 2009, which is called for short BPM6. And why this is important is because the World Bank and most central banks, so for example, also the Central Bank of Nigeria, count the numbers on this basis, on the definition of this BMM6. So under this framework, personal remittances are really two things added together. One is the personal transfers. So any money or any goods that are moved between a household here and a household to another destination, no matter how the sender earned it or how they're related. And that's really deliberately left really broad as a definition of what we used to have before as the workers' remittances idea. So here we really talk about personal remittances and not the worker remittances, which was used as a definition before. The second thing is that it also looks at the compensation of employees. So for example, what seasonal and short-term cross-borders workers actually earn, minus the taxes, of course, and the travel. And here again, there's a wider bucket on top of that, that also counts the transfers to things like hometown associations. So it's really a broad definitions that we use in terms of what remittances actually is. Just to really give a small, short example to have it a bit more concrete idea. Let's say, for example, a migrant in France wires money home to Nigeria. That's a personal transfer. If that same migrant's wages abroad gets logged in the balance of payments as compensation of employees, that counts too. So money to people plus earnings of workers, and that's a bit the whole package that we have. Now, this is all good, and at least we have a definition. Now, the flip side or the problem or the problematic issues that we have in terms of official figures. This is where it gets a bit tricky because official figures mostly see money moving through formal pipes. That is to say, through banks, licensed transfer operators, mobile money, for example, nowadays also through an app. The issue is sometimes we miss a little bit this informal framework. So for example, like the Hawala style networks of when cash is sent through this Hawala network, cash carried by hand, of course, goods in kind. So this is sometimes a bit the blind spot. There was later on the presidential task force, for example, I'm using Nigeria as an example here, reckoned that there was much as 18 billion, which may never have actually gone through the official channels at all. So 20 billion is what we actually know. And of course, there's also this informal pathway where we don't always know the statistics or we don't always know the whole picture of it. So we're not really capturing most of it in real time. And there's a lot of, we talk about the undercount because actually it might even be bigger than 18 billion, for example. When we look at, for example, the regional aspect, the neighbor to neighbor corridors inside of Africa, so the West African or the Sahel region. So this is a little bit the background where we work with. So there's this official numbers that we know of, and then of course there's a bit more the informal aspect that is a bit of a hidden number. I'm just maybe going towards the other question that you had on. So why does it matter? Maybe I go into a bit more details on what actually remittance is and what maybe another type of remittance is out there and especially in the migration studies. And here, for example, so remittance is really a financial thing, but we also talk about social remittances. And here again, for decades, migration was really looked as kind of a sad story where actually when someone moves away from their country, the country itself is losing workers and that's it. And remittances or the study of remittances kind of flipped something into a bit more interesting. And this is then the story about households and development. And for example, one of the kind of the main name in migration studies, Hein de Haas, he coined an interesting phrase for this, the migration development pendulum. So this is really where scholars keep saying that migration is great for development, or on the flip side, that migration is a disaster. So there's always this pendulum of a more pessimistic view and a more optimistic view. So it keeps going back and forth depending on which scholars or which school of thought scholars actually look at. But why does this matter actually so much? One is the scale, of course. Remittances to low and middle income countries really blew past even $685 billion. And of course, this is much higher than the official aid. For example, in the African context, this could be even the scale of 42 billion within the African context. Another reason why it matters is stability. So of course, unlike foreign investment, remittances are counter-cyclical. What does that mean? So for example, when we have a crisis, and we can go into a bit more detail, for example, the COVID, we've seen that during the COVID time, actually remittances went higher because there was a crisis at that moment and there was more need for example, families living in the African context, there was more need for money. So usually there's a cycle of when there's a disaster or when there's a problem, that the remittances actually increase in those times. Another aspect is the reach. So the remittances really skip kind of governments entirely and land straight into the households. So it's a really direct kind of aid into the households where the money is then sent to. So that tells us also about the welfare of migration, not just the causes of migration. And then, of course, we talk about theory. For example, the last decades, I would say we've kind of talked a bit more about the transnational aspect of migration, not only one person going from A to B, but then also there's this transnational element of migrants, or what they for example see themselves, or there's the whole research also on belonging, of once they've migrated to another country, they still kind of retain their own identity, but then they start maybe perhaps thinking I belong more in my host country than in my origin country. So that's when we talk about transnationality.
Coming to what you talked about, migrants, going to a different country, and then through them being in that country, contributing to the growth and development of their own country through the remittances that they send, and the change in the narrative of seeing that as something negative. We know this brain drain comment that is seen as negative. There is something positive in that as well, in the fact that they are sending back money through the remittances to help develop their own country. There is also an aspect of, it's more of migration, but there is also an aspect of what it's bringing to the host country itself. When you were talking about it, they say, if all Nigerians would leave the West, there would be no doctors, there would be no nurses. Yes, so there is that effect as well on the host country. Could you comment on that as well?
Of course. And this is where we talk about the skilled migration. So there is some research that shows, for example, in the Nigerian context, there's the top 5 countries where Nigerians actually move to. Of course, one of the top ones are the US and the UK. And there we see, for example, these are really high-skilled migrants, so nurses, doctors. And here you see a little bit more those who are actually able to move. So, for example, these are all legal migrants. So they move out to study abroad, and then they stay abroad, and they actually stay in the host countries. But maybe at a certain point, they might also think of returning back to Nigeria, returning back to their home countries. So this is really a bulk of it, of the highly skilled migrants. Then the research also shows, of course, that there is a lot of intra-African movement. So, for example, the other countries were within West Africa. So this might be a bit different. This might also be a bit of a short term. So, for example, they might think of going across the border to another country to work and then come back. So maybe this is also a bit more the circular migration aspect of it. So yes, of course. And we always there's always a bit of a negative and positive view of saying, okay, those who are highly skilled, there is a brain drain. That's exactly that they leave the country. Those who actually should be staying in the country to develop their own country. But then there's also a brain gain on the other side, that there might be other migrants going into Nigeria who might then fill this gap. So there's always a bit of a balance to look at, of this brain drain and this brain. And then, of course, also we talk about how the diaspora outside of Nigeria could actually contribute to the development of Nigeria itself. Even though they're not really present in their own country, they might also contribute financially, but also in other ways. For example, we've seen there's a lot of research also on political contributions, of how the diaspora outside of their own country actually contribute to the country through political efforts, through, for example, startups, or working with trying to develop things also in their own country. So we always have to see a bit both sides of the coin, I guess. Yeah. And then what's really interesting, and that's something that I always liked a lot, is we talk about remittances, yes, but there's also social remittance. And there's quite a lot of scholarship or studies on this as well. this coin phrase, social remittance, came back a little bit from the 90s from Peggy Levitt. And she then really talked about this idea of it's not only that money that travels back to their home country, but it's also ideas, norms, technologies, political values. And it was quite interesting because she talks about different types of social remittances. So, for example, it can be anything intangible. So it could be values, practices, expectations, democratic values, even business culture, kinship obligations, which is a bit more of a social and perhaps maybe sometimes a bit more difficult to capture and to study. But I think it's really important to say that we don't only talk about the financial aspect, but we also talk about the social remittance it can be interesting as well to look at.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to ask about the skills, the ideas, the business practices, the social norms that the migrants share with their home communities and how these are different from financial remittances. And why can they be just as transformative even when no money changes hands? Is there any way that this influences innovative ecosystems in different countries, for example, in Lagos or any other country? Do you have any example of how that would influence the economic ecosystem of a certain city or a country?
Yeah, so I just maybe one concrete example that I can give is, let's say again, for the Nigerian context, there has been some research also on, for example, how the diaspora-driven democratic activism can be important. So, for example, returnees seeding tech startups in Lagos, for example. Also, the religious and cultural trafficking between the countries of where if they're abroad, for example, let's say London or Houston. So there's always this transnational kind of aspect between where they are living in London or Houston as one of the top destinations of where Nigerian migrants usually go, but also within, for example, for a lot of times in the startup community. So they for example, really provide some help or some support with a startup, for example, in Lagos. So this is maybe one example. And for example, so this is a bit the back and forth scale. Another example is also the family. And a lot of times we tend to forget the unit of the family as not only the individual themselves, but of course there's a whole family behind it as well, of how that family then, how the interaction is with the migrant who's living outside abroad, but then with a family that is still in their home country. And there are some studies here that show also this force or this kind of need for the migrant then to also support the family. And there's sometimes also a little bit of this exigence from the migrant to help or support the family as well. Not only financially, but perhaps also on the social aspect as well, or culturally.
Yes, I can agree to that. When the households get their money from the migrant, what do households typically spend these remittances on? How do they balance immediate needs with longer term goals such as saving or investing? Do you have any research or any information on that to share with us?
Yes, indeed, there was quite a lot of studies done. And again, I use the Nigerian context as that's I'm most familiar with. So it's interesting to see that they do, at least now I'm talking a bit more on the financial side, like what actually the financial remittances actually provide or support. Education is really one of the biggest spending kind of remittance that is provided. Health is also another aspect. So for example, just to give you a little bit of some numbers, the three main aspects of what remittances actually support, what accounts of these remittances is consumption, education, and then health. And I have one number that says, for example, that 74.3% of remittances really flow into these three types of aspects of support. So consumption, education, and health. There was one, for example, study by Fonta and colleagues, a bit older, from 2015. For example, they surveyed nearly 700 people picking up money at transfer points across Enugu and Anambra states, for example, in the Nigerian context. And they found that 74% of every flow goes to these three things combined. So, for example, consumption, education, and health. Whereas they found that savings was a bit lower. So for example, investment in land, in buildings or shares were only under 1. So this, you see the difference. The 74% was really into education, into healthcare, and only 1% or less than 1% was really into investment in land or buildings. So this
I
really,
think it has I think it has a kind of a social kind of tonation to it, because investing money would mean I'm growing myself, I'm developing myself, I'm taking care of my future. And if you think of that the money is sent to support you, right, from the person receiving it, they would rather use it to support themselves, pay the school fees, pay medical bills, pay emergency costs, rather than, setting up a business and investing in houses and real estate, because of the nature of the money and the social intention behind the person giving them the money. Are we seeing any real development from the money that is being sent?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. Exactly, because as we've seen, or a lot of the studies that show that exactly this remittances is used for relief, so immediate relief where there's need for healthcare, for education, for example, to bring kids to school. So this money is really used as a short-term relief of what actually the needs are, and less so for long-term investments. So that's a little bit the problematic issue of between migration and development. Does remittances really then provide the development of the actual country? And this is a bit the tricky question, because a lot of times, and again, I come back to the aspect of the informality. So sometimes we don't even know how this money is transferred or where this money is transferred into, because we don't have the official statistics. And that's where it becomes a bit more difficult to see the whole picture. And this is always a bit the question. So does this really help for long-term investments? Does this really help for the long-term investment of the country itself? And this is what then also begs the question of how the policies are, or how the country itself or the government itself actually regulates remittances, or provides the framework that actually helps for this remittances to really bring in not only the immediate relief that is needed, but then to a longer term aspect for development. Yeah.
Yes, I agree with you that there has to be policies that will help the remittances to strengthen families and remove a creation of dependency and expectations and even tension between the relatives at home and the relatives abroad. So now let's look at another aspect, which I would call the class aspect. So how do remittances affect communities? Do remittances affect communities differently? For example, not every community experiences migration in the same way. How do the effects of remittances differ between urban and rural areas? Are they helping reduce inequalities, or can they sometimes even widen the gap between households that receive remittances and those that do not? Could you give us some information on that?
Yeah, so surprisingly, we can say that remittances cuts poverty in both city and the countryside, so this urban and rural divide. But their effect, for example, on inequality points to different directions, depending on where you are and depending on what you look at. So the number, or the studies that we've had, or we can see, is that there is, for example, remittance income, the score of inequality, for example, where we look, there is a wider gap between the cities and the rural areas. So, for example, why is there these differences? It comes down who's receiving actually the remittances. So if we talk about domestic remittances, so money moving within the country. Now we're talking about actually domestically within the country itself, tends to even things out. But international remittances is another aspect as well. So we always make the distinction of if the money flows within the country or if the money comes from international remittances, which we can divide these two things. So for example, here we see that the international remittances usually land with relatively better off rural households. So let's say this means that the ones with educated members, for perhaps a bigger land holdings, the families who could afford to send actually someone abroad in the first place, they're the ones really kind of taking advantage of this the remittances. In the countryside, where money overseas can really widen the gap. And there is a study by Oloa and Shitu, for example, that rural households pour more into education and housings, while urban ones put more remittances into investments and goods, which is more durable. So all in all, we cannot say that remittances reduces inequality, because it could be depending where you look at. So this urban rural divide sometimes has a bit of a difference between who actually receives a remittance and what is done with this remittance for the money and the financial money that they receive.
Exactly. So now let's talk about creating a middle class. One argument we often hear is that remittances, we know that it's mainly for emergencies, but people also buy homes, they start businesses, they invest in their future. But is that enough to create a lasting middle class? Or are remittances more often helping families stay afloat and avoid poverty rather than fundamentally changing their economic position?
Yeah. That's also a very, very interesting question. And again, the evidence is a bit mixed and a bit contested in this aspect. Let's say from the optimistic side, remittance receiving households do show a higher spending per head. So, for example, have more ownership, home ownership, have more small businesses that are started. That's kind of the remittance middle class, if you want to call it that. And an asset building is really concentrated in property. So, for example, there was one number that I came across, is that 87% of remittances flows goes into the construction and home purchases, for example. So very much concentrated on buying property, on having land and developing that land. But again, that cuts both ways. So building a house is building an asset, yes, but it doesn't necessarily create jobs or expand what the local economy actually produces. There was one study in 2025, so more recently, that they found that in family firms, domestic remittances, not international, so we're talking about domestic remittances within the country or within the region, do more for job creation. So this kind of hints that the overseas money transfer is more of consumption rather than a productive growth. So again, they found that the domestic remittances within the country or the region provides more stability for having to building up or to supporting the families rather than international. Again, this is the difference or the divide between international remittances and domestic remittances. And there's another study by Akanle, and Akanle is one of the top names in this sense because they've done a lot of research, Akanle and Adesina. They really argue that relying on remittances can actually replace local entrepreneurship than fuel it. So they say, for example, that remittances can be positive, yes, but then there's a lot of reliance on it, and there's no other possibility of having the local entrepreneurship. That's kind of the negative aspect of it. So can we say there is a real middle class in sense of comfort and security? Yes, but then the question is always, it could be fragile, because when it comes to job creating, the productive engine that makes a middle class last, that's a bit the question. There's a safety net, yes, but then how does that go into the bigger picture of not only the migrant or the small family unit themselves, but then the bigger picture of the country as a whole. So it's a bit of a contested area as well in terms of what studies have shown. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Simona. It's really fascinating to see how a simple monthly transfer can completely pivot a family's social trajectory, yet at the same time introduce these complex dynamics of social dependency and localized inequality. So, Simone, I want to thank you for bringing these ground level realities to light today. And to our listeners, that brings us to the end of part one of our mini series on remittances and development. Today, we looked at the why and the where and the human stories, household impact, and the powerful flow of social ideas. But how does that money actually get there in the first place? What happens when global financial instability shakes the plumbing of the system? In our next episode, part two, we're moving from household to the global pipeline, and we'll be discussing the infrastructure, how digital tech, fintech startups, and mobile money are revolutionizing these transfers, and how fluctuating currencies and global economic crises directly hit West African homes. I hope you will join us. You won't want to miss it. Until next time, thank you so much, Simona, for joining us, and talk to you next time. Thank you for listening, and bye bye.